The snow fell in silence over the Ardennes forest on December 18, 1944, near the ruined village of Rocherath, Belgium, 8 miles south of the German border. Corporal James William Hartley, 29 years old, lay wedged behind a fallen oak, his left shoulder torn open by shrapnel 3 hours earlier when an 88mm shell had shredded his observation post. The fabric of his uniform was stiff with frozen blood. His breathing came shallow and measured, each inhale sending a white knife of pain through cracked ribs. The world tilted slightly when he moved his head too fast. His right hand, the steady one, trembled just enough to notice. He had been a sniper with the 99th Infantry Division for 6 months. Before that, he had been a ranch hand in Montana, a deacon's son who read his Bible every Sunday and believed in clean shots and cleaner conscience. Now he lay in frozen mud, listening to boots crunching through ice, and tried to remember if killing a man to save others made the sin smaller or just made you responsible for both. His spotter, Private Leland Cross, had been killed in the same blast that opened Hartley's shoulder. Cross had been 19. Hartley had promised the kid's mother in a letter 2 weeks ago that he would look after him. He kept his promises, until he didn't. Through the Schmidt and Bender scope mounted on his M1903A4 Springfield, Hartley watched a column of Wehrmacht soldiers emerge from the tree line 420 yards downslope. 12 men, winter camouflage smocks over field gray. 2 carried MG-42 machine guns. 1 officer walked in front, a map case under his arm, gesturing with confidence that came from 3 days of successful German advance. They were moving toward a crossroads where Captain Marsh and 43 American soldiers from Baker Company had dug in after their retreat from the frontier. Wounded men, low on ammunition, no armor support. The Germans did not know they were there yet, but they would, in minutes, when their patrol reached the ridge and looked down into the shallow valley where Baker Company waited, with nothing but rifles and hope. Hartley had 4 rounds left in his Springfield. 4 cartridges of .30-06 ammunition, brass cold to the touch, primers that might misfire in this temperature. His hands shook. His vision swam when he blinked too hard. Blood loss made his thoughts slow and sticky. He knew what doctrine said. He knew what his training said. Engage targets of opportunity. Disrupt enemy operations. But he also knew what his mother had taught him in a kitchen in Billings, her hand on his head, her voice tired from Sunday hymns, "Thou shalt not kill." And he knew what his father had said when he left for the war. "Some things are worse than dying, son. Living wrong is one of them." The German officer stopped. He raised his field glasses and scanned the valley. Hartley's finger rested outside the trigger guard. Not yet, not yet. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, too fast, unsteady. If he fired, he would reveal his position. 12 men would turn their weapons on him. He might kill 1, maybe 2 if he was fast. Then they would kill him, and the patrol would continue, and Baker Company would be overrun, and 43 men would die because he had hesitated or because he had not. This was the arithmetic of war. This was the gospel nobody preached. The officer lowered his glasses. He pointed toward the crossroads. The column began to move again. Hartley exhaled, slow and controlled, the way his grandfather had taught him to shoot antelope across open prairie. Settle the body, quiet the mind. Let the rifle do the work. But his body would not settle. His shoulders screamed. His ribs grated with every breath. The tremor in his hand was small but growing. He thought of Leland Cross, who had believed Hartley could keep him safe. He thought of Baker Company, men who did not know his name, who would never know what happened here. He thought of the German officer, who might have a wife, who might read a Bible too, who might believe his cause was just. 420 yards. Wind from the northwest at 8 miles per hour. Temperature 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold made the air dense, the bullet flight flatter, but it also made his fingers stiff. He adjusted for windage, 1 click left on the scope. The crosshairs settled on the German officer's chest. Center mass. The shot doctrine said to take. Hartley closed his eyes for 2 seconds. When he opened them, the world was sharper, colder. He moved his finger onto the trigger. The Springfield had a pull weight of 5.5 pounds. He had fired this rifle 237 times in combat. He knew its personality, knew the way it kicked, knew the sound it made when it ended a life. The German officer turned his head, speaking to the man beside him. Hartley saw his profile. Young, maybe 30, clean-shaven, human. The arithmetic shifted, turned into faces, turned into souls. If Hartley fired, he would kill this man. If he did not fire, this man would kill others. There was no clean answer. There was only the choice, and the weight it left behind. His father had said some things were worse than dying. Hartley wondered if his father had ever held a rifle scope on a stranger's heart and tried to reconcile Matthew 5:44 with the necessity of murder. The column was 100 yards from the ridge now. Seconds left. Hartley's vision tunneled. His breath stopped. The tremor in his hand vanished, replaced by something older than fear, older than doubt. Muscle memory, training, the thing that turned men into instruments. He began to squeeze the trigger, pressure building slowly, inevitable, like the turning of a season. The German officer laughed at something. The sound carried across the snow. Hartley heard it. He kept squeezing. The rifle fired. The recoil drove into his shattered shoulder, and the world went white with pain. He did not see where the bullet went. He rolled left, worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered another round. His vision cleared. Through the scope, he saw the German officer still standing. The round had missed. Impossible. He never missed at this range. But his hands were shaking again, and his shoulder was bleeding fresh, and the cold had settled into his bones. The officer turned toward the sound of the shot, scanning the tree line. The column froze. One of the soldiers shouted a warning. They began to spread out, taking cover, bringing weapons to bear. Hartley had 3 rounds left. His position was compromised. The arithmetic had failed. He had revealed himself, and he had not stopped them. Now they would find him. Or they would find Baker Company, or both. He adjusted his aim, slower this time, steadier. The pain helped. Pain focused the mind, burned away everything except the task. He found the officer again in the scope. The man was crouched now, moving toward a fallen tree, barking orders. Hartley led the target, accounted for movement, exhaled halfway, and fired again. This time the officer dropped. The sound of the shot echoed through the forest, sharp and final. The German soldiers dove for cover, shouting, firing blind into the trees. Bullets snapped through branches above Hartley's head, clipping bark, sending splinters into the snow. He worked the bolt again, ejected the casing, felt it tumble hot against his frozen hand. 2 rounds left. The tremor was worse now. His shoulder had opened fully, blood soaking through the field dressing and into the snow beneath him. He was leaving a trail. They would follow it if they came up the slope. One of the German soldiers ran toward the officer's body. Hartley put the crosshairs on him and fired. The man spun and fell. 1 round left. The remaining Germans returned fire in earnest now, systematic, disciplined. They knew where he was. The MG-42s opened up, ripping the forest apart with 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound like tearing canvas, relentless and industrial. Hartley pressed himself flat, bark and frozen earth pressing into his face. He could not move, could not run. His body had nothing left to give. But the patrol had stopped advancing. They were pinned, focused on him. And that meant Baker Company had time. Time to see the threat. Time to prepare. Time to live, maybe. The arithmetic had shifted again. 1 sniper, dying in the snow, buying minutes for 43 men who would never know his name. Hartley thought that might be enough. Thought it might balance the ledger. Thought God might forgive the killing if the reason was love. He did not know if that was true. He suspected his father would say there was no clean ledger in war, only different kinds of debt. The machine gun fire stopped. Silence returned, heavy and watchful. Hartley lay still, listening. Boots on frozen ground, moving cautiously uphill. They were coming. He had 1 round left and no strength to run. He thought of his mother's kitchen, thought of Leland Cross, thought of the German officer's laugh, cut short, and wondered if the man's wife would receive a letter, and who would write it, and what it would say. The boots came closer. Hartley shifted the rifle, slow and quiet, lining up on the sound. His vision was fading at the edges now, gray creeping in. Blood loss, shock, the end of things. He never fired the last round. A sudden roar split the air, and the German soldiers scattered. Hartley turned his head, confused, and saw smoke trails arcing over the trees. Artillery. American artillery, called in by Baker Company, now that they knew the enemy's position. The shells landed among the Germans with brutal precision, fire and steel tearing through the patrol. The survivors ran, retreating back down the slope, abandoning their dead. Hartley watched them go, his finger still on the trigger, the last round still chambered. He had not needed it. The one bullet he had landed, the officer's death, had been enough. It had stopped the column. It had bought the time. It had saved the 43. He let the rifle fall into the snow and closed his eyes. The gray crept inward. He heard voices, American voices, shouting his name. Medic, stretcher. Hang on. He tried to answer but could not find the words. His thoughts drifted to Montana, to open sky and clean air, to a church pew and his mother's hand in his. He wondered if she would be proud. He wondered if God kept a ledger. He wondered if one bullet could redeem a man, or if redemption required something more than survival. They lifted him onto a stretcher. The pain flared bright and total, and then receded into numbness. As they carried him through the snow, Hartley opened his eyes one last time and looked back at the forest. The German officer's body lay half buried in white. No marker, no name, just another casualty in a war too large for mercy. Hartley closed his eyes again and let the darkness take him, not knowing if he would wake, not knowing if he wanted to, knowing only that he had done what his father said was worse than dying. He had lived wrong, and he had lived right. And in the end, the difference between them was a single bullet and the weight it left behind. But whether James William Hartley survived that day, whether he saw Montana again, whether the 43 men of Baker Company remembered the sniper who froze a battalion in the snow, those answers lie ahead, in the hours and days that followed, in the choices still unmade, in the reckoning that every soldier faces when the shooting stops, and the silence demands a different kind of courage. Do you believe 2 soldiers alone could change the course of a battle? Comment what you would have done in their place, and subscribe to discover more forgotten stories from World War II. Corporal James William Hartley woke to the smell of disinfectant and the low murmur of suffering. The field hospital had been established in a stone barn 3 miles behind the lines, its walls pocked with old shrapnel scars, its floor covered in straw and blood. Overhead, naked bulbs swung from wire, casting shadows that moved like ghosts. He did not know how long he had been unconscious. Hours, perhaps. Maybe a full day. Time had become elastic, unreliable, measured only by the rhythm of pain that pulsed through his shoulder with each heartbeat. A medic leaned over him, young and exhausted, eyes older than his face. The man said something Hartley could not fully hear. His left ear still rang from the artillery blast, a high whine that would not stop. The medic's lips moved again. Hartley caught fragments, stable, lucky, surgery. He tried to nod, but the movement sent lightning through his ribs. The medic pressed a hand to his chest, gentle but firm, and Hartley stopped trying. Around him, other wounded men lay on cots and stretchers, some silent, some crying out in sleep, all of them paying the same price for the same few miles of frozen ground. They operated on his shoulder that night, a captain with steady hands and no anesthetic to spare. Hartley bit down on a leather strap and stared at the ceiling beams while the surgeon dug shrapnel from muscle and bone. He prayed the rosary his mother had taught him, silently, moving through each bead in his mind. Hail Mary, full of grace. The pain was absolute. The Lord is with thee. It erased everything else. Blessed art thou among women. When it was over, he did not remember passing out. He only remembered waking again, bandaged and hollow, with the taste of copper in his mouth. 2 days later, a lieutenant from Baker Company came to see him. The man was older, maybe 40, with a face carved by weather and consequence. He stood at the foot of Hartley's cot and said nothing for a long moment, just looking at him the way a man looks at something he does not fully understand. Then he spoke, his voice quiet and deliberate. He said that the German patrol had been stopped. He said that Baker Company had held the crossroads. He said that 43 men had survived because a sniper with 4 bullets and a shredded shoulder had bought them the time they needed. He said those men wanted Hartley to know. Hartley turned his head toward the wall. He did not want gratitude. Gratitude implied heroism, and heroism implied choice, and he was not certain he had chosen anything at all. He had simply done what the moment demanded, and the moment had demanded killing. The lieutenant waited. When Hartley did not respond, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the cot beside Hartley's hand. Then he saluted, a gesture both formal and sorrowful, and walked away without another word. Hartley waited until the lieutenant was gone, before he unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a spent cartridge casing, 30-06, the brass tarnished and cold. Someone had engraved 2 words along the side with a knife point, crude but deliberate. 1 bullet. He stared at it, turning it slowly in his palm. This was the round that had killed the German officer, the round that had stopped the patrol, the round that had saved 43 lives and taken 1. It felt heavier than it should, as if the weight of the decision had settled into the metal itself. He kept the casing. He did not know why. Perhaps because it was evidence. Perhaps because it was penance. He slipped it into his pocket and tried not to think about the man whose life it had ended. But the thinking came anyway, relentless and unforgiving. He wondered if the officer had been a good man. He wondered if good men existed in war, or if war simply turned all men into instruments of necessary evil. He wondered if God measured intent or only outcomes. His father had spoken often about the narrow road and the wide gate, about how few would find the path to righteousness. Hartley suspected the narrow road did not run through battlefields. The days in the field hospital blurred together. Morphine when they had it, whiskey when they did not, silence in between. Hartley watched other men die, some quickly, some slowly, some calling for mothers who would never answer. He watched chaplains move among the wounded, offering prayers and last rites, their faces drawn with the exhaustion of trying to reconcile a loving God with the evidence of his absence. One chaplain, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, sat beside Hartley's cot one evening and asked if he wanted to talk. Hartley said no. The chaplain nodded and stayed anyway, reading quietly from a pocket Bible, his lips moving without sound. After a while, Hartley asked him a question. He asked if killing to save others was a sin. The chaplain closed the Bible and looked at him for a long time before answering. He said that war forced men to make choices no man should have to make. He said that God understood the burden of those choices even if men did not. He said that grace was not the absence of guilt, but the presence of forgiveness, and that forgiveness began with the acknowledgement of what had been done. Hartley asked if that made it right. The chaplain said no. It only made it bearable. They discharged him from the field hospital on Christmas Eve, 1944. His shoulder was ruined, the mobility gone, the nerve damage permanent. He would never fire a rifle with precision again. The army gave him a Purple Heart and sent him to a rear echelon unit in France, where he processed requisitions and tried not to think about the forest or the snow or the sound of a German officer laughing before the bullet found him. He wrote letters home, careful and sparse, telling his mother he was safe, telling her nothing about Rocherath or Baker Company or the casing in his pocket that he carried everywhere like a talisman. The war ended in May. Hartley was on a transport ship in the Atlantic when the news came, and the men around him celebrated with shouts and tears and embraces. He stood alone at the rail, watching the dark water roll beneath the hull. and felt nothing. Victory did not erase what had been required to achieve it. Peace did not resurrect the dead. He thought of Leland Cross, 19 years old, whose mother would spend the rest of her life waiting for a son who would never come home. He thought of the German officer, whose name he would never know, whose family would receive a letter and a folded flag, and a grief that had no ending. He thought of himself, still breathing, still alive, and wondered if survival was its own kind of punishment. He returned to Montana in June, to the ranch and the open sky and the church where his mother still prayed every Sunday. She held him at the door and wept, and he stood rigid in her arms, unable to weep with her, unable to feel anything except the hollow weight of what he carried. His father shook his hand and looked into his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would bridge the distance between the man who had left and the man who had returned. They were not the same person. War had made certain of that. Hartley tried to return to the life he had known. He worked the ranch, mending fences and tending cattle, his ruined shoulder aching in the cold. He attended church, sitting in the back pew, listening to sermons about redemption and forgiveness and the peace that passes understanding. He did not find peace. He found only the memory of a scope's crosshairs and the terrible calculus of who lived and who died and who made the choice. At night, he dreamed of the forest, of snow and blood and the sound of boots on frozen ground, of a German officer turning toward him, laughing, unaware that the next breath would be his last. One Sunday in August, the pastor spoke about Abraham and Isaac, about the moment when God asked a father to sacrifice his son, and the father raised the knife in obedience. The pastor said it was a story about faith, about trust in God's plan even when the plan demanded the unthinkable. Hartley sat in the pew and felt something crack inside him. He stood abruptly, walked out of the church, and did not return. His mother found him later that afternoon, sitting on the porch, the brass casing in his hand, staring at the engraved words. She sat beside him and waited, patient and silent, the way she had waited when he was a boy and the world had seemed too large to understand. He told her everything. He told her about Rocherath and the patrol and the officer and the 43 men. He told her about the weight of the rifle and the tremor in his hand and the prayer he had whispered before he pulled the trigger. He told her about the guilt that followed him like a shadow, the sense that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that he had become something his mother would not recognize. When he finished, she took his hand, the one that still trembled, and held it between both of hers. She said that love sometimes looked like violence. She said that mercy sometimes required sacrifice. She said that God did not ask men to be sinless. He asked them to be faithful. Hartley wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that faith could redeem the choices he had made, that grace was large enough to cover the blood on his hands. But belief was harder than pulling a trigger. Belief required a kind of courage he was not certain he possessed. He looked at the casing, at the words engraved there, and wondered if one bullet could ever be enough. Enough to justify, enough to atone, enough to carry a man through the rest of his life without breaking him. Years passed. Hartley stayed on the ranch, unmarried, quiet, a man defined by absence. He spoke little about the war. When veterans gathered in town, sharing stories and toasts and the easy camaraderie of shared suffering, he did not join them. He could not reconcile celebration with what he remembered. He lived simply, worked hard, attended church irregularly, and carried the brass casing in his pocket until it was smooth and warm from constant handling. It became a ritual, a way of remembering, a way of not forgetting. He owed the dead that much. In 1953, he received a letter. It came from Belgium, forwarded through military channels, the envelope worn and creased from its long journey. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in careful English by someone who had learned the language late. The letter was from a woman named Marguerite Rousseau, who lived in Rocherath. She wrote that she had been 17 in December 1944, hiding with her family in a cellar while the battle raged above. She wrote that American soldiers had saved her village, held the crossroads, stopped the German advance. She wrote that she had learned, years later, about a sniper who had been wounded, who had fired the shot that stopped a patrol, who had given the soldiers time. She wrote that she wanted him to know her family had survived, that her children had been born, that life had continued because of what he had done. Hartley read the letter 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table in the house where he had grown up. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it in his Bible, pressed between the pages of Matthew, where Jesus taught about loving enemies and turning the other cheek. He did not know what to do with Marguerite Rousseau's gratitude. It did not erase the German officer's death. It did not make the choice righteous, but it reminded him that the arithmetic of war was not only about loss. Sometimes it was also about preservation, about the lives that continued because others had ended, about the terrible, necessary balance that men were forced to strike when the world offered no clean options. He never answered the letter. He did not know what to say, but he kept it, and he kept the casing, and he kept waking each morning to tend the ranch and watch the Montana sky and carry the weight of December 18th, 1944. He grew old, slowly, his hair turning white, his body bending under the accumulation of years and injury. His mother died. His father followed. The ranch passed to a nephew who did not know the whole story, who saw only an aging man with a ruined shoulder and a habit of silence. On a winter morning in 1982, Hartley stood in the snow outside the church where he had been baptized. He was 77 years old. The brass casing was in his pocket, as always, worn smooth as a river stone. He had come to bury the pastor who had spoken about Abraham and Isaac, the man whose sermon had driven him from the pews 37 years before. Standing at the graveside, listening to the hymns and the prayers, Hartley felt the old questions rise again. Had he been faithful? Had he been righteous? Had one bullet been enough to balance the ledger, or had it only added another line to the debt? He would never know. Certainty was not granted to men who lived in the gray spaces between doctrine and necessity. But standing there in the cold Montana wind, with the snow falling soft and silent around him, James William Hartley allowed himself to believe that God understood, that grace was real, that the narrow road could run through battlefields if the heart that walked it carried love alongside the rifle. He reached into his pocket and held the casing one last time, feeling its weight, its history, its burden. Then he let it go, dropping it into the snow at his feet, where it disappeared without a sound. He walked away from the grave, alone but not empty, carrying only the memory now, and the hope, fragile and unproven, that mercy was larger than the choices that defined him. Behind him, the casing lay buried in white, a small relic of a war that had ended decades before, but whose costs were still being paid, one soul at a time, in the quiet arithmetic of forgiveness and the terrible enduring weight of love. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and see you next time.